Welcome back. We are continuing our look into the book of James. We have been making our way through chapter 3. This last week we looked at the tongue and all of the different colorful images that James shows us, with the bits of horses and the rudders of ships and the forest fire and the deadly venom, the restless evil, all of these wonderful images that he draws on to illustrate the problems with the tongue and how it has to be bridled. And if you do that, you have your entire person taken care of. You can mind what's going on inside you coming out of your mouth. Well, this time we're going to look at another related idea, and that is the wisdom. Where does that wisdom come from? Okay, if you bridle what's inside of you, what's inside of you, you might say. Where does that wisdom coming from? Where is that wisdom coming from, and how are you going to act with your life? And so this is, as I've said in the past, a very important section in the book of James, as it brings together many of the ideas that we have in the book. We saw this wisdom from above idea much earlier in chapter 1, how God gives from the Father of lights. He gives freely to anyone who asks. And so now we have it really here, almost in the center of the book, something that summarizes much of what the book says, and that is the choice between one of two ways: the wisdom from above versus the wisdom from below. And this is, again, something that James is very concerned with. Who are we going to follow? Ourselves, and if we do, we're really giving in to the prince of the power of the air, the demonic realm, Satan himself. Or are we going to follow our Lord? We're going to follow him and be allied with him, show allegiance, so loyalty to him. And so that's really what's at stake. That's what's really at stake in this passage. And actually, it continues on into this next section, into chapter 4. As we'll see a similar passage where he's going to talk about these same things he brings up: quarrelings, ambition. What is the source of all of that? And we'll look at that in our next section. Well, without further ado, let me go ahead and read this full passage. Who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. So we have at the beginning of this the question. James is very fond of these big questions. Sometimes he's rhetorical, sometimes he answers them as he does here. The question is fairly straightforward. Who is among you that's wise and shows understanding? And before he gives us the chance to answer that question, he answers it by saying, by his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. Now, here we have a reminder of works, and that should point us back to the previous chapter, where he went on a fairly lengthy section talking about faith without works being dead, and talking about how those who claim to be in the faith, claim to follow the Lord, must have works that back that up. So without getting into that whole discussion, if you want, you can go back and listen to some of that background there. But he's pointing us back to that equation, pointing us back to that teaching. But he also says that the answer is that good conduct is done in meekness of wisdom. We'll talk about what that phrase means in just a second. But then he gets in the first of these two ways. The first way is the wisdom from below, and the second way is the wisdom from above. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. I love those three adjectives, just boom, boom, boom. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder or chaos and every vile practice. So just in summary here, he is, and what I love about the way that he does this with these two, wisdom from above versus wisdom from below, the wisdom from below has its point of origin from below, which is its proponents are us. We're part earthly and demonic. That is, that we are following or obeying the powers of darkness if we give into this. But it also has, because we'll see in the last section, that there's going to be this farming or agricultural metaphor about the fruits of the good fruit that comes forth in this harvest of righteousness. You might call the fruit of the wisdom from below, bitter jealousy and selfish ambition, and how those lead to the result of disorder and every vile practice. Well, that same idea of the proponents or the source of wisdom falls into the wisdom from above, as do the fruits and as do the results. And so let's, with that kind of idea in mind, let's read this last one. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of good mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere, and a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. Now, in that last section, what really stands out are these adjectives, these descriptions and a list of what a Christian character is meant to look like. Peaceable, gentle, which is another word for meekness, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. Many of these, as we'll see, find an exact parallel in the Sermon on the Mount as far as the Beatitudes go. And so there's a lot of similarity between what James says here in his wisdom from above to what Jesus says as he's standing on the mountain delivering this message, and as the second Moses figure, not actually receiving the message but giving the message directly. We have James doing and saying similar things to what Jesus says on the Sermon on the Mount here in this really important section, perhaps the most important section in the book of James, or the peak of bringing together all his ideas. And so with that, we could even just stop here, because we've covered the main ground of what this passage is trying to say. But because this is a very important section, there's a lot here that we can look at and nuance that I think can give us some real insight. And so we'll continue on and delve into some of these more nuanced elements of this passage. And the first thing I'd like to point out is in this opening line. It's really interesting that he puts these two words, wisdom and understanding. Now, you might say that doesn't sound all that odd, and you'd be right if you're reading the book of Proverbs, read about wisdom and understanding ad nauseum through all 31 chapters. But what is interesting is that the second word for understanding, which we have listed here in James 3:13, does not appear in the New Testament elsewhere. It appears in the Old Testament in Greek, that is to say that the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And in one place, actually it occurs twice in this passage, in Deuteronomy 1:13-15, we have it stated that Moses is told to choose among the tribes men who are wise and have understanding, experienced men, and I will appoint them as your heads. That is to say, Moses had a lot on his plate, and they come to him saying that cases are not being heard. We need more leadership. Well, one of the things they do is they seek the Lord's counsel, and they seek Moses' counsel, and then they choose among them those who are wise and understanding. Now, what's kind of interesting about this to me, and this is always something I find really fascinating, is what does James have in mind when he's putting this passage together, when he's reading this? Because of course, he doesn't probably have this scroll open, but he's influenced even by these very words and the ideas, and perhaps he's even thinking about a passage like this when he writes that. Maybe not even consciously, but subconsciously, this truth is flowing through him. And I'm reminded many times how we do this regularly, how in our day-to-day lives things will come up that we need to address scripturally, and how we'll bring one scripture and another idea of wisdom together to answer these questions. And it's just encouraging when we see this again, because this is biblical. This is the way that we can be followers of the Lord who are rooted in His Word and doing these things to really answer difficulties, which is really the path of wisdom. Skill in living is a definition of that term. Now, another aspect of this is that if we remember in James 3 verse 1, it says that not many of you should be teachers. And that leads into that whole section about the tongue. And so some have suggested that this is still within that context, that perhaps James 3 and perhaps much of James 4 is being addressed primarily to teachers in the Jewish Christian community. And if so, this is really interesting because that's exactly what Moses is really talking about, choosing these wise and understanding men who will be teachers and judges for the people. And so James is saying much the same thing. Who's going to be wise? Who's going to show understanding? But here it's a question. Who is wise? Who shows understanding? And then he's going to answer that with this meekness of wisdom. Now, what I find also interesting about this is these two figures that are often contrasted with one another, the Apostle Paul and James, the brother of Jesus. They actually have a very similar take on many topics, but one in particular here, this even the way Paul draws this out in 1 Corinthians 1 shows a lot of similarity. Now, if you haven't read this passage before, you haven't read it recently, I highly recommend 1 Corinthians 1 and 2. It's just so rich with this same kind of thinking. But what's really interesting about Paul is that he is someone, unlike James, who is both rooted in high-level Jewish understanding. He's a Pharisee of the Pharisee. He's a scribe. He's a real scholar of the law, which James clearly knew his scriptures as well. But probably did not experience the same level of training as the Apostle Paul. But Paul also is very well versed in much of Greco-Roman wisdom and philosophy and these wisdom of the age teaching of the philosophers. And that's actually what 1 Corinthians 1 deals with. It's drawing on these to where he's answering both Jewish and especially Gentile critics about wisdom. Let me just read this passage and then I'll make a couple comments. Notice the questions. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of the age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. Now, within the context of 1 Corinthians, this is building up to talking about the foolishness of the cross with compared to Jewish understanding and Gentile understanding, and that itself is its own fascinating and very rewarding passage. But what I'd like to point out here is, despite their very different backgrounds, Paul and James, at least in the worlds that they're going to inhabit in the early Christian movement, and of course before that, when James was not even a follower of Jesus, don't know much about his backstory, but certainly not, we don't think he was training the way Paul was. Whereas Paul is living in a completely Gentile context early on, and then of course moving to Jerusalem, they share much of the same perspective. They share this truth. And what is that truth? Well, the wisdom of their age, of our age, is not the wisdom of God. The wisdom of God is seen not in boastful, prideful statements of power, but in weakness. That God's power is made perfect in weakness. That those who would be wise, those who would show understanding, those who would obey, would be meek. It's right there in the first beatitude. The meek shall inherit the earth. And that's what's just so encouraging is, despite their differences, the message is the same. And the reason why the message is the same is because it's the message of Christ. It's the message that we see shining through not only the gospel, but the character traits that Jesus calls for among those who follow him. And that's really what James is so concerned with, what Paul is concerned with, is that our lives be characterized by the high calling to which we have been called. Now, anytime you ask the question, who's wise, who shows understanding, you should immediately go to a couple different characters in the Old Testament. Now, the first one, and the obvious one, is Solomon. Solomon, well known for his wisdom. We'll look at something that happens towards the end of his reign and something that happens at the beginning of his presentation as king at the end of this section. This is the Queen of Sheba. She visits from far off, either in Ethiopia or present-day Yemen, or perhaps a combination of those. In any case, all the way down the Red Sea, she makes her way up to visit Solomon because she's heard of his great wisdom and his wealth. Now, when she came, she heard of his fame concerning the name of Yahweh. She came to test him with hard questions. How do you answer these hard questions? Well, you answer it with wisdom. He answered all her questions. There was nothing hidden from the king that he could not explain to her. And when the Queen of Sheba had seen all the wisdom of Solomon, his burnt offerings that he offered at the house of Yahweh, there was no more breath in her. And so if we think about who's wise in the Old Testament, we think about who is the pinnacle of wisdom. Well, in Jewish thinking, it is Solomon. Solomon is the ultimate wise guy in a good sense. He is the one who is able to answer all of these hard questions, and most of these have to do with judicial questions. He can answer all of them. This is something that is extremely valued in the ancient Near East, in ancient Judaism and ancient Christianity. And just as an aside to this, Jesus does much the same thing. In fact, we can take this same passage in this same place, and we can put upon it the events of Passion Week. Jesus comes into a later temple, but still, again, the temple of God in the same place, and he answers these questions. The Pharisees throw questions at him, the Herodians throw questions at him, the Sadducees throw questions at him, and finally at the end, they're scared to ask him any questions because he just nails each one. You can also think, and Jesus tells the disciples, tells those who listen, something greater than Solomon is here. And so this idea of wisdom being extremely important is crucial. But as we'll see, in this section, it's not just the idea of being wise to answer hard questions, but it's also how one conducts themselves to show meekness in wisdom. And for that, we should turn to another one of the Old Testament's most famous wise guys, and that is Job. And we have this painting here showing Job as he's being confronted by his friends, and they're coming to him and saying, "You've done all these things wrong. It's got to be something wrong you've done." And Job's answers the whole time is, "I've done nothing wrong, and yet I'm waiting on the Lord." Well, it's a wonderful book. It's something that we can read, but it gets a little bit lengthy of 35 chapters of this, and it's such a breath of fresh air when the Lord finally breaks in and tells Job what's up. He tells him, after Job has answered many times and he's kind of questioned what God is doing, even though he's waiting on the Lord. He tells him out of the whirlwind, saying, "Who is that darkens counsels by words without knowledge? Dress for action like a man. I will question you and make it known to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know." The sarcasm here is dripping. "Or who stretched the line upon it? Or on what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone?" And here's one of my favorite lines. "When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy." It's showing heaven's angelic host, the sons of God, shouting for joy at the creation of the world. This just celestial, grand scene that God has witnessed and called into being and created these people from the dust. And they're asking and questioning him, what's his plan? And his response is, "I'm the one in charge and you're not." You may not always know what the answer is. It may seem like God is inactive or not there or not responding. And yet the response from the Lord is quite clear. He is in control. He does have a plan. He is active at all times. And so I think it's important here when you think of the idea of meekness of wisdom, that at the root of that is the idea that God's in control. That God's in control of everything that's happening around us, that we are not people to boast in anything that we can do or act, because he's the one in control. And because of that, that meekness of knowing who we are in relationship to God is so crucial to the book of Job, and it's crucial to wisdom in general. And so we've looked at Solomon as an example, kind of the pinnacle of Old Testament wisdom. We looked at Job, kind of a separate pinnacle, you might say a lowly point of wisdom, one who is plumbing the depths of what wisdom is versus Solomon who's plumbing the heights of what wisdom is. Kind of interesting too that Solomon starts out like a rocket and ends down, and Job is the opposite. It actually has this up and down thing. But now let's look at Jesus, because Jesus also makes these same points. And in fact, it's Jesus's life that's going to characterize the Christian method of how we are to follow. So the manner in which James describes meekness of wisdom, I think, is best shown in the way that Jesus champions the idea of being meek, of being humble, of being gentle. And one of the more important passages to look at comes in Matthew 11. Come to me, all who labor and who are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle, same word here as meek, translated just differently, and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And so what we're seeing here in Jesus in using this image is he's saying that his yoke that he puts on us, the mantle that he has, the yoke that he has, that he's driving forth, is one of humility, of one of meekness. And that's what we are called to also. And so just as the one who deserved all of the highest praises for all of his earthly titles, all of his heavenly titles, ultimately became a servant to the point of serving others and serving the Lord with death on a cross, so are we called to that meekness and humility. And we see Jesus saying that. We see it here, James saying much the same thing. Well, with that, let's move into this middle part of this passage in James 3:14 through 16. I'll read this once more time. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but it is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder in every vile practice. So as we said at the outset, these two, the wisdom from below and the wisdom from above, have a common way of the way James portrays them. He talks about their origin or their proponents. The origin here is the earth. It's from below. The proponents of that are us. We think that this is wise to live this way, to have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition. But it's not just us, it's those who are demonic. And what I like about this is it puts here unspiritual and demonic, which means to say that spirit is the idea of being spirit fed in the positive sense. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above. And he brings together and says that the fruit of that type of wisdom is bitter jealousy and selfish ambition. So you might say that this is the opposite of meekness and wisdom: bitter jealousy and selfish ambition, seeking yourself, seeking your own goals, your own life, and again, as any time this applies to. But if we're thinking about applying this to our own lives, this is a hard one, because the reality is we live in a time where the values of our age are not in line with Scripture. how people really do, whether they are celebrities, whether they're politicians, whether it's just really anyone you meet, the championing of their own self, their own ambitions, their own will over those of others is something that we encounter all of the time. Now, what is interesting about this passage, as he moves from the proponents, that would be us, people, and demonic realm, and then he gives us the fruit, and how that takes us to the result, how that actually leads to all disorder and every vile practice, and everything behind this is ambition and jealousy, which we might also call pride. If we're going to do that, we can apply it all the way back to the opening chapters of the Bible, Genesis. The pride of what we see and what we want, we take because we want it for ourselves and we don't want to obey. But it's a warning, not just generally to anybody who would listen, but this is a specific warning to Christians. Why do I say that? Well, look what it says about in the first part here in verse 14. In your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. So in other words, they are saying they follow the truth, but if they are boasting and they're wanting to go after their own wishes, their own desires, which are driven by jealousy, that shows they're not being true, that they are boasting and they're actually being false to their calling. And so what is important here is that we see again and again how James will marry these two ideas. That what happens, that we do, the wisdom of this age, the wisdom on earth, is our own thinking, but it's also the wisdom of the demonic realm. We've seen that throughout this book, is that we can't trust our own wisdom. It is not the wisdom that comes from above. The wisdom that comes from above is outside of us. It's a wisdom that we can't get to on our own. It's the wisdom that God gives. And so we need to question our intentions. We need to question our motives, because as James describes, if not, we're giving in to this earthly, unspiritual, demonic wisdom. And just because it shows here this falseness, I really thought of John 8, and this happens when Jesus is talking in the temple, and he says, "You are of your father the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks out of his own character, for he is a liar and a father of lies." And so when we follow our own way, when we follow our own ambition, in John 8, that's exactly what's happening. They're literally trying to get Jesus off the scene because he is about to take over their position. They're worried about their position with the people, literally a selfish ambition and bitter jealousy. He is saying that you're giving into a lie. You're following after your father. And so as we see here, those who would want to sit in the seat of Moses, there's actually, again, a seat of Moses that we've seen in the past, to seek this is wrong. But to follow the Lord in meekness and wisdom is the right path. Well, I also wanted to point out just how clear this is also in the Gospels. Now, I don't think here we see anything supernatural in the sense of demonic possession or anything like that. But we do see that the actions of those who seek after their own will, again, are being driven by the powers of darkness. Now, I absolutely love this mosaic, and I try to show it as much as possible. This mosaic is from a church in Magdalene, which is quite new. It was just finished a few years ago, and it's actually in this nice little alcove, so it's like you're walking and looking into it. And it shows Mary Magdalene, who has these 7 spirits, and there's these 7 like brownish figures, and one of them is a serpent like on a tree. So it's also playing with this idea of Eve, and the Lord casts these out of her. That's really, we only know this about her in one verse, about Mary Magdalene. But I think what I want to draw out here is that both the Gospels and James, as well as really the entire New Testament, are putting us in a battle between the forces of Jesus, forces of God and his Messiah, following him in truth, versus the power of this age, versus the powers of the devil, who are here on earth wanting us to act according to their will and plan. And who will we follow? That's what he's getting us to again and again. What's in your heart? How are you acting? What are you being driven by? Are you double-minded or double-souled? Are you one who is wholly true or all the way on this side, or are you being pulled in both directions? And so again, Mary Magdalene was one who was in one camp and then pulled to the Lord. Now, another one that I think is really interesting here is that this word that he uses for ambition, we have Aristotle describing this word. It also only appears once in the New Testament. And he describes this word, or what ambition means, as a selfish party spirit that governed many politicians in his day. What I love about that is, as he often is, Aristotle is quite relevant to any time period, but very much a wise teacher in our own day, if we think about selfish ambition, how that can drive much. And I think that's one of the hard parts about ambition. Ambition in itself is not necessarily evil, but it has to be driven by our right standing in the Lord. And I also like to look at another passage from 1 Corinthians where we see much this idea drawn out in 1 Corinthians 3. But I, brothers, could not address you as a spiritual people. Notice that similarity too with what we just read. Those who are spiritual. But as people of the flesh, as infants in Christ, I fed you with milk, not solid food, for you were not ready for it. And even now you are not yet ready, for you are still of the flesh. We could say is another way of saying human, earthly. For while there is jealousy and strife among you, are you not of the flesh and behaving only in a human way? For when one says, I follow Paul, and another, I follow Apollos, are you not being merely human? Now, in the case of Corinthians, this is a deep-seated division over the leadership in the church and how they're to follow these different teachings. So it's really an issue of partiality and favoritism, but between different leaders. The issue that James often addresses is the partiality shown towards wealthy people who attended these congregations versus the poor. But the point is the same, that you're following something that is selfish and jealous towards trying to get their wealth, whereas here it's the same idea we read in Corinthians. So once again, it's just so nice to see it's the same teaching because it's the same model. The model is Jesus. He's the model that both Paul and James are following, this model towards a holy life. Now, another, I think, classic example of someone who has bitter jealousy and ambition is the character of Nimrod and Nimrod's castle, or Nimrod's tower. We sometimes call it the Tower of Babel. Now, I have here a ziggurat, which is probably what the Tower of Babylon, Tower of Babel would have looked like. And this is, I might say, the earliest and most quintessential example of what human ambition looks like. They have been told to be faithful and to be obedient and to scatter and to inhabit the earth. That's what it says in chapter 9 after the flood. Well, instead of that, it says the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. Then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we just be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. Now they're building something like this, a ziggurat, because they're in their conception of the ancient world, the gods would come at the top of a structure, just like this here, and this is where they would come down. So they're trying to come and convene with the gods, trying to recreate that and be in one place, and really shaking their fist in the face of God and following their own wisdom. So that's really the story of the Tower of Babel. Another one that I really like in the Old Testament, I like it because it fits. It's an evil person, Balaam. And we read about him in Numbers 22 through 24, but the New Testament sees him as a major figure of disdain, of jealousy, and selfish ambition. In 2 Peter, we read, they have hearts trained in greed, accursed children, forsaking the right way. They have gone astray. They have followed the way of Balaam, the son of Beor, who loved gain from wrongdoing, but was rebuked for his own transgression. A speechless donkey spoke with a human voice and restrained the prophet's madness. Woe to them, for they walk, this is Jude, in the way of Cain, and abandoned themselves for the sake of gain to Balaam's error, and perished in Korah's rebellion. And so Balaam is this figure. He's hired by Balak, the king of Moab, to prophesy and destroy the intentions of Israel and the intentions of God. God says, you're not going to do that. You're going to do what I tell you. And we have that great episode with the donkey telling him that there's an angel staying in the path. And we have him, it's a beautiful section, just answering the donkey, which is kind of the humorous aspect of that. Now, what's really kind of funny about that passage is that it almost sounds like something fictitious from Narnia, or some other fantasy story. But actually, we have an extra biblical source which mentions Balaam. And that's what's over here on the left. I didn't just put up some random piece of a white painting or something. That's actually an inscription that mentions Balaam, son of Beor, the same character that's mentioned in the book of Numbers, who was apparently a famous person in this part of the country, even to those outside of Israel. And he's famous in the Bible, infamous, you might say, for his selfish ambition and jealousy. Well, we might also say, and again, as we're approaching this wisdom from above, that there's a list here. Now, the list is not very long, but it says bitter jealousy and selfish ambition. And it leads to all of this disorder and every vile practice. Now, James is going to give a list of the things that the wisdom from above leads to, but this is really similar, as we'll see, to the fruit of the Spirit, this famous passage in Galatians. But in Galatians, Paul gives a list of the works of the flesh, and then he gives a list of the fruit of the Spirit. And what I like here is to show the commonality between what we read in James 3 and what we read in Paul. He lists sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, but then he lists things that are very similar to this idea of bitter jealousy and selfish ambition. Enmity, strife, jealousy, fits of anger, rivalries, dissensions, divisions, envy, and then ends with these others, drunkenness, orgies, and things like these. And so they're both, again, on message with this idea that if you seek after your flesh, if you follow the wisdom of your heart, it will lead you astray. And much like here, we have this rotten, bug-eaten fruit. That is what you will end up with as far as your life. But, and this is a good but the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere, and a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. This really harkens back to the first chapter, chapter 1, where we read this same idea. It says, every good gift and every perfect gift is from above. Notice there it also says, don't be deceived. We just read that if you believe this, you're being false, you're boasting, and you're not telling the truth. Well, if you're deceived, it's both yourself and Satan, the demonic realm, who's doing this. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above. The things that are good come from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. Now, I read that, and I point out this here to show how he's already introduced this idea in chapter 1, but how he also uses similar imagery. He talks about the wisdom from above. Here it's the good gift and the perfect gift. But he also brings it back to this agricultural image. In chapter 1, it's these first fruits of creation. Here in chapter 3, it's our character traits that are being described as a harvest of righteousness, these good fruits to those who live by wisdom from above. And so it's just so beautiful, in my opinion, to see how this writer is thinking along the same lines, and he's saying something at the beginning because he wants to come around back to it and make this point. We've seen how he's done this with how he talks about how the tongue is something that can't be bridled. If you bridle your tongue, you have good religion. And then he saves that whole discussion. He goes on a rabbit trail, talks about other things, and then comes back to it as a longer treatment. And so it's good how he structures these things and hints at them before, and it really adds a lot of weight to the impact of his wise teaching. And so again, James is quite skillful in how he puts these things together. Now, the other thing I'd like to look at here is this list. And what I've done here is I've tried to show the similarities between what we read in James and what we read about in the Sermon on the Mount. Here's a look at the place, the traditional location of the Mount of Beatitudes. And there we have, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the meek, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, blessed are the merciful, blessed are the pure in heart, blessed are the peacemakers. And here we can look at these same character traits. We have pure in heart, peaceable, peacemakers, gentle, which is synonymous with being meek, open to reason, that one doesn't exactly fit in, full of mercy and good fruits. Now, if you change those into make them mercy, like surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of life, I like to see how that connects with Psalm 23, something that we really might remember in that well-known psalm. We also see him saying impartial. Now, here, what's cool about this is that the things that are added, especially impartiality, is something that he has already talked about. He talked about it in the previous chapter, in chapter 2. Don't show partiality. Now, that doesn't appear in the Sermon on the Mount, but it is on message with what James is saying in his book. And so he's bringing together what Jesus has said in the Sermon on the Mount. He is not regurgitating it, but he is writing it down in much the same way. And he's also, by saying this, giving us the message from above. You know who it originates from? It originates, of course, from God, but it originates from Jesus. This is the same message that Jesus taught. So he is the one from above. And lastly, it's here it says sincere, someone who is sincere in their faith, someone who follows through, someone who has integrity. And then in these last one, it says harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. One of my favorite passages about thinking about conflict and making peace is Romans 12:18, which says something along the lines of, as long as it depends on you, live at peace with all men. There is a really long-standing and said multiple times in the biblical text to be peaceful, to have peace with one another. And again, as we enter into a new age in our interaction with the world through social media. Now, I know it's been around for a while for us, but something that is entirely new if we think about the history of the world. This is something that's really relevant to be peacemakers, to be people of peace who make amends, who live in peace with one another. And as I said before, this also can be compared to what we read about in Paul with the fruit of the Spirit. There he lists love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such there is no law. We find some of these same virtues, some of these same characteristics appearing in James. And so once again, Jesus, as recorded in the Gospels, James, as the Lord's brother, bringing to bear much of the Sermon on the Mount, but his own teaching, as well as the Apostle Paul, it's the same message, it's the same characteristics that we see. Now, lastly, here, as a kind of last example to thinking about peacemaking, um, we're going to end with Solomon. We asked who is wise and who shows understanding. Well, this is one of those quintessential events in the life of Solomon that was so powerful and legendary. And I'm not saying it didn't happen, I'm saying it became a legend of how impactful it was to Jewish and even Gentile communities. Now, it originates at this place in Gibeon where the young king goes. The altar of Moses was still there, and he goes to there to offer sacrifices even before the temple is even built. And he asks the Lord, and he says, "Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to govern this, your great people?" It pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this. And I would just say, this is what we need to pray. This is what we need. We're not necessarily, although we might be called to great renown or great responsibility to govern people, but this is, we're all given difficulties and trials. And this is what we need. We need an understanding mind to govern our lives, to govern our children, to govern our responsibilities, to live at peace with all people, to meet head-on challenges like things like the virus, or things like rioting, or things like how do I budget my life, how do I do all these and meet all these challenges. Well, we need to ask the Lord. We need to come before him. Solomon was faced with enormous challenges. Young king, his older brother tries to get him kicked off, Adonijah. He's got all these rivals. He's faced with all these challenges, and yet the bedrock of his long reign was this understanding that he asked from the Lord. And he gave him this gift of wisdom. Now, the quintessential aspect of this wisdom is this one story. Now, of course, in the book of Proverbs, we have many of Solomon's proverbs, but what this chapter ends with is how the writer of the book of Kings sums up Solomon's wisdom. Now, before I read it, I just want to comment on this amazing fresco from Pompeii. Pompeii, as you might know, was destroyed in 79 AD by Vesuvius, a volcano that erupted, and preserved many of the houses almost to full height. Some of them are missing the ceilings, but you have 3/4 of the walls preserved. And this fresco, which was on one of the walls, is of Solomon. Now, what's crazy about that is that this is in Italy. This is in the city of Naples, and we have what is likely the house of a Jewish family, and on their wall, most likely a Jewish family, we have a depiction of Solomon. There he is holding the staff with his council, and it's a depiction of this very event. So let me read it. And notice who's watching, trembling off to the side. It's on the far left. And the king said, "Divide the child in two, and give half to the one and half to the other." There they are. That's Aristotle and Socrates, the two of the most well-known people in all of Greco-Roman philosophy. Now, this statement, that I just read, is part of this longer section, this trial between these two women. One, they're both prostitutes, and they both have children. And in the night, one of the children is accidentally killed in sleep, where the other one survives, and no one knows about whose children belongs to who, except the two women. And the two women go before Solomon, and they say, "This one is mine," and the other one says, "This one is mine." Of course, someone is lying. And so it's this quintessential conundrum. What will Solomon do? Well, his response, as something we know, perhaps the most well-known proverbs and the most well-known stories in the Bible, as I just read, he says, "Divide the living child in two, and give half to the one and half to the other." Then the woman whose son was alive, who we see depicted here as the soldier is about to cut the child in two, she yearned for her son. "O my Lord, give her the living child, and by no means put him to death." But the other said, "He shall be neither mine nor yours. Divide him." Now, if that's not the quintessential example of bitter jealousy, I'm not sure what is. Then the king answered and said, "Give the living child to the first woman, and by no means put him to death. She is his mother." And all Israel heard of the judgment that the king had rendered, and they stood in awe of the king. Notice it's the same response that the Queen of Sheba has, because they perceived the wisdom of God was in him to do justice. To do justice. And what does that remind us of? That reminds us of the end of chapter 1. Right? True and unbridled religion before God is to care for widows and orphans in their desolation and to be unstained by the world. Well, we long for that justice. We long for that wisdom. Solomon had it, but he was led astray. Jesus will have it. He will return. And yet these teachings that we read here are so crucial for us to think through and live by. We need the logic and wisdom and understanding of Solomon. And thankfully, the Lord gives it to us if we ask. And if we ask in faith with no doubting, as it says in chapter 1. This is the wisdom from above. We pursue it not out of our own desires and ambitions. We pursue it to live a humble life driven by allegiance to the Lord. Well, in this beautiful section, we saw how James poses this question: who is wise? Who shows understanding? He then answers it. The one who shows his works, again, harkening back to that faith that works is dead, does it through meekness. He or she does it through meekness of wisdom. He then describes these two ways. Those who follow wisdom from below, the proponents of that idea are human and demonic. We follow our own desires, our own wishes. That leads to the fruit of jealousy and selfish ambition. We could also say pride. The result of that is total disorder, total chaos, and every vile practice. We saw how James describes it in other places, how Paul even gives these long lists of what that would lead to. Thankfully, there's another way. There's a wisdom that comes from above. The proponents of that are none other than God himself, God the Father, who's given us this. We also said that because James draws on this from the Sermon on the Mount, and because he often equates the very wisdom of God with the wisdom and teaching of Jesus, is that this comes from our Lord, from Jesus. The fruit of the wisdom from above is purity, a life that is pure, marked by pureness, and even the message from above is pure. There's nothing darkening it. It's coming directly from the Lord. It's peacefulness, it's gentleness, it's reasonableness, it's mercy, it's goodness. It also shows impartiality, and it is sincere. The result of this type of wisdom following this path will result in a harvest of righteousness. Those who follow the wisdom from above, those who follow the teachings of the word, who pursue meekness in wisdom, have a harvest of righteousness, a life characterized by right living, caring for others, and having peace. Now here, again, I think that the emphasis of this passage largely has to do with dissension. It has to do with those who would act out and create this confrontation. Now, James is not saying that we should avoid all confrontation, but he is saying that part of what is driving many confrontations and driving many arguments and driving much anger is the war that's happening inside of us, the war of our own bitter jealousy and selfish ambition, our own pride. That's what's driving it. That's not saying that we shouldn't stand on the truth and we shouldn't argue for things that are truthful and be those who are proponents of the oppressed and proponents of those who need our protection. That would go against what he's already said in chapter 1 about caring for widows and orphans. So we need to care for those who can't care for themselves. We also need to check our own heart and check our own ambitions. And actually, that's what's going to lead us into our next session. We're going to see how there are quarrels happening in the bodies that James is teaching to, and he's going to say, where is it all coming from? He's going to point back to it being from following the wisdom from below. And he's going to hearken back to many of these things that we've talked about in this lesson. So, well, we'll catch up on that next time. A lot of nice things on the horizon.